They crossed the Atlantic in the bellies of ships, crammed into holds that reeked of salt and sweat and fear. More than 370,000 German soldiers captured in North Africa, Sicily, France, and the dying fields of Europe, bound for a land they'd been taught to despise. America, the land of mongrels and money worshippers. The land that, according to the propaganda they'd consumed since boyhood, would show them no mercy. In those dark crossings, many wrote farewell letters they never intended to send. They whispered prayers in dialects from Bavaria and Prussia, from the Rhineland and Saxony. They had seen what happened to prisoners on the Eastern Front. They knew the stories, real and invented, of Soviet brutality. And they had been told again and again that the Americans were no different, that Jews controlled Roosevelt's government, that Germany's enemies were subhuman, incapable of honor or compassion. Some of these men had been true believers. Others had simply been boys when the war began, swept up in a machine too vast to resist. But believer or conscript, they shared one certainty as they approached American shores. They were sailing toward their graves. The first shock came not with violence, but with its absence. At processing centers along the East Coast, they were met not by firing squads, but by clerks with typewriters. They were fingerprinted, photographed, assigned numbers. Their wounds were cleaned and bandaged. Those who were sick were taken to infirmaries. One Wehrmacht corporal from Frankfurt would later write that he kept waiting for the beating to begin, for the facade to drop. It never did. The Americans, he wrote home with palpable confusion, were treating them according to the Geneva Convention. They were loaded onto trains, and through the windows they saw an America untouched by war. Fields of corn stretching to impossible horizons, cattle grazing in afternoon sun, small towns with white churches and children waving from porches. No ruins, no craters, no burned-out tanks rusting in town squares. This was not the collapsing plutocracy they'd been promised. This was abundance beyond imagination, and they were still alive to witness it. The camps themselves deepened the dissonance. Rows of wooden barracks surrounded by wire, yes, but clean. Orderly in places like Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Concordia in Kansas, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, they found not dungeons, but compounds with running water, electric lights, and latrines that functioned. The beds had mattresses, there were blankets. The shock of basic dignity was, for many, almost unbearable. Then came the food. This might have been the cruelest revelation of all: 3 meals a day. Meat, bread, vegetables, coffee that was actually coffee, portions that satisfied hunger rather than prolonging it. Men who had spent months eating sawdust bread and turnip soup now faced American rations that exceeded what German civilians were receiving back home. Some refused to eat at first, convinced the food was poisoned. Others wept. A Panzer grenadier from Düsseldorf admitted in his diary that he gained 20 pounds in his first 2 months of captivity, and the shame of it haunted him. His family was starving while he grew fat on enemy generosity. The Americans put them to work, not as slaves, but as paid laborers, 40 cents a day in camp scrip, later 80 cents. They harvested cotton in the South, picked fruit in California orchards, cut timber in the forests of Wisconsin. They worked alongside American farmers whose sons were fighting in Europe, and the absurdity of this arrangement was not lost on either side. A young German lieutenant found himself helping an elderly farmer in Nebraska repair a barn roof. The farmer's boy had died at Normandy. They worked in silence for 3 days, and on the 4th day, the farmer offered him a Coca-Cola. The lieutenant had never tasted anything like it. He would remember that kindness for the rest of his life. Inside the camps, something unexpected began to take root. The prisoners organized themselves, formed orchestras, theater groups, art classes. They built miniature towns within the wire, complete with shops using camp currency, libraries, even small chapels. At Camp Como in Mississippi, they constructed an elaborate replica of a German village square, with a fountain and gardens. At Fort Getty in Rhode Island, they painted murals that still survive today. They were not languishing, they were living. Sports became obsession. Soccer matches drew hundreds of spectators, both prisoners and guards. Boxing tournaments, volleyball leagues, even chess championships that lasted weeks. The Americans supplied the equipment. They supplied everything. One guard at Camp Concordia would later recall watching German prisoners play soccer on a Sunday afternoon and thinking how impossible it would be to explain this scene to anyone who hadn't witnessed it. The enemy, well-fed and laughing, playing games on American soil while American boys died on German soil. Education programs emerged, sanctioned by the camp authorities and often organized by the prisoners themselves. Men who had abandoned their studies to fight now returned to mathematics, languages, engineering. Some camps offered university-level courses taught by captured German professors and intellectuals. The University of Florence in Arizona, the Camp McCain Conservatory in Mississippi. These were not crude propaganda exercises. These were genuine institutions of learning sprouting in the strangest of soils. And then there were the letters home, heavily censored, carefully worded, but impossible to entirely sanitize. A soldier from Stuttgart wrote to his mother, "I am treated well, better than I have been treated in years. Do not worry for me." Another from Hamburg, "The food here is plentiful. I work in the fields. The Americans are not what we were told." These letters filtered back to a Reich in its death throes, and some recipients refused to believe them. Propaganda, they said. Coercion. But others wondered, and doubt, once planted, is difficult to uproot. The American guards were an enigma. Some were recent immigrants themselves, speaking German with the prisoners, sharing cigarettes, showing photographs of wives and children. Others maintained strict distance, professional but not unkind. A few were hostile, especially those who had lost brothers or friends overseas. But systematic cruelty was absent. The rules were enforced, but the rules were fair. For men who had lived under the arbitrary violence of military hierarchy, this consistency was revolutionary. Interactions with American civilians varied wildly. In some towns, locals protested the presence of the camps, angry that the enemy was being housed and fed while rationing pinched American families. In other places, curiosity won out. Church groups visited. Women volunteered to teach English. There were stories, some confirmed, some apocryphal, of friendships formed, of prisoners invited to Sunday dinners, of an unspoken recognition that these were men, not monsters. A prisoner working on a farm in Idaho was given a piece of apple pie by the farmer's wife. He later said it was the first time in 3 years he'd felt human. But humanity came with a price. The psychological conflict was profound. These men had fought for the Reich. Some had believed in it deeply. They had killed for Germany, watched friends die for Germany. And now they were being treated with decency by those they'd been trained to see as racial inferiors and moral degenerates. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. A Luftwaffe pilot in a camp in Tennessee wrote in his diary, "They give us everything, and I hate them for it. I hate that they make me question everything I fought for." The re-education programs accelerated this crisis. Beginning in 1944, the US Army launched initiatives to expose prisoners to uncensored information about the war, about Nazi atrocities, about the real state of Germany. They showed newsreels. They provided newspapers and magazines that hadn't been filtered through Goebbels' ministry. They screened footage from liberated concentration camps. Many prisoners refused to watch. They called it Jewish lies, Allied propaganda. But some watched, and some could not look away. The hardest converts were the true believers, the SS men, the officers who'd risen through the party ranks. They organized resistance within the camps, intimidating those who showed signs of wavering, enforcing Nazi discipline behind the wire. There were beatings, even murders, when suspected collaborators or anti-Nazis were discovered. The Americans tried to separate the fanatics from the rest, creating special compounds for the ideologically committed. But the tensions remained, the war within the war. For others, the breaking point came not from propaganda, but from absence of news. Letters from home stopped arriving or arrived months late, filled with blackened passages where censors had redacted references to bombing raids and civilian casualties. Men learned of their cities being incinerated in single nights. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne. A prisoner in Camp Alva, Oklahoma, received word that his entire street in Berlin had been erased. His wife, his daughters, his parents. Gone. He sat on his bunk in a camp in the American plains, well-fed and safe, while his world had been cremated. The guilt was a living thing. As 1945 unfolded, reality became impossible to deny. The newsreels showed Allied armies advancing from both sides. The prisoners could do the mathematics. They knew the war was lost. But the moment of collapse, when it came, was still a shock. Hitler dead. Germany surrendered. The 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years. In the camps, reactions split along predictable lines. Some wept. Some celebrated in secret. Others retreated into numb silence. A few committed suicide. The Americans began showing films of the liberated camps. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, skeletal figures staring at cameras, mountains of corpses, gas chambers, crematoria. The prisoners were made to watch. Some vomited, some fainted. Many insisted it was fabricated, that such things were impossible, that Germany could never. But the images were irrefutable. And slowly, in ones and twos, then in larger numbers, the edifice of belief cracked and crumbled. A former Hitler Youth member, captured at 19, sat through one of these screenings at Camp Crossville in Tennessee. Afterward, he walked to the fence and stood there for hours, staring at nothing. When a guard asked if he was all right, he said only, "We are monsters. What have we done?" Not all were transformed. Some carried their ideology to the grave. But thousands were changed, fundamentally and irrevocably. The combination of humane treatment and undeniable truth created a space for reflection that would have been impossible in the chaos of defeat on German soil. These men had time, they had safety, they had food, and they had no choice but to confront what they'd been part of. By 1946, the repatriation began. They were shipped back across the Atlantic to a Germany that no longer existed. The cities they remembered were ash and rubble. The government they'd served was a historical obscenity. They returned to a population traumatized, starving, and occupied by the very armies that had held them prisoner. Many found their families dead or scattered, their homes destroyed, their futures blank. But something had changed in them. The experience of captivity in America became a secret credential in the post-war years. These men had seen that another way was possible. They had witnessed a society that, whatever its flaws, did not operate on the principles of domination and annihilation. They carried that knowledge home, and it shaped the reconstruction of Germany in ways both subtle and profound. Some returned to their towns and helped rebuild with a new understanding of democracy and human rights. Others became teachers, journalists, politicians, working to ensure the next generation would not repeat the sins of their own. A former Wehrmacht sergeant who had picked cotton in Mississippi became a schoolteacher in Bavaria, and in his classroom he spoke about the importance of treating even enemies with dignity. He never told his students about his time in the camps, but the lessons he learned there informed every word he taught. The paradox was cruel and inescapable. These men received mercy they had not extended. They were treated according to laws their nation had violated systematically. They were given food while German prisoners in Soviet camps starved and froze by the millions. The inequity of their good fortune was staggering, and many spent the rest of their lives grappling with it. But history is made not only of justice served, but of opportunities seized. The American treatment of German POWs was not perfect. There were incidents of abuse, of neglect, of failures to meet the standards set by international law. But by and large, the United States chose to treat its captives as human beings, entitled to basic dignity. That choice reverberated through decades. It created a generation of Germans who had experienced American values not as abstractions or propaganda, but as lived reality. It planted seeds that would grow into the Marshall Plan's success, into NATO, into the Atlantic Alliance that would define the second half of the century. They had expected death and found America. Not the America of mythology or propaganda, but the real, complicated, generous, and flawed nation that gave them bread instead of bullets. For 370,000 men who had marched under swastikas and fought to destroy democracy, that experience became a strange and powerful education. Some rejected it. Many embraced it. All were marked by it. In the decades that followed, as Germany rebuilt itself as a democratic state, as it confronted its history and committed itself to never again, The influence of those who had been prisoners in America remained largely invisible but undeniably present. They were fathers who taught their sons different lessons than they'd been taught. They were citizens who insisted on accountability and the rule of law. They were voters who understood that nations built on hatred and lies devour themselves. The wire and the watchtowers are long gone. The camps have been ploughed under or converted to other uses. The men who lived behind that wire are nearly all dead now. But the legacy persists, in the choice to treat enemies as human, in the understanding that even in war, there are lines that must not be crossed, in the radical notion that mercy is not weakness, but a strength that can reshape the world. They crossed the Atlantic expecting death and found instead a second chance at life. What they did with that chance mattered, and in the end, perhaps that was the most American thing of all. The stubborn belief that people can change, that redemption is possible, that even the worst of us might still become better. That belief, extended across the wire to men who wore enemy uniforms, helped build the peace that followed the most terrible war in human history. It didn't erase what had been done. It didn't absolve the guilt or resurrect the dead. But it offered something else, a glimpse of a different kind of world, one not governed by the logic of total war and absolute enmity. For a handful of years, in camps scattered across the American landscape, that world existed, and for the men who lived in it, nothing would ever be quite the same.